One ring to rule them all, one ring to bind them. Maya Govan and Melyn am Menix Wilaid. My name's Rainbow Dave and welcome to another Tolkien Untangled lore video. Today I will be talking all about the One Ring, and I will try to discern exactly how this ring works and how it binds all other rings of power in Dominion. And this can be quite a confusing topic because, of course, the One Ring was the last ring of power to be forged. The 3 and the 7 and the 9 all existed before the 1, and so it may seem strange that they are all so completely bound to it, to such an extent that they all fade and lose their power after the 1 is destroyed. And yet that is what Tolkien wrote. And so, to understand this, we need to go back to a time before the Rings of Power, when a mysterious being called Arnatar came bearing gifts to the elven lord of Eregion, Celebrimbor. Now, Celebrimbor was the founder of the Brotherhood of Jewelsmiths, who became known as the Gwaethi Myrdain. They are among the finest craftsmen in all of Middle-earth. And Arnatar was the Lord of Gifts. He gave a gift to Celebrimbor, and that gift is crucial in understanding what the One Ring is and how it works. Because, of course, Arnatar was not who he claimed to be. He was indeed a Maya spirit, and he did indeed once study his craft at the feet of Aule himself, who's kind of like the god of crafting. But he did not come as a friend. The Lord of Gifts was in fact just a fair alias taken by Sauron. It was step 1 in his plan to dominate all of Middle-earth and to craft it into an ordered world that he considered perfect. But the gift that Sauron gave was not a ring. The rings had yet to be forged, all of them. What Sauron gave to Celebrimbor and the Gwaethi Myrdain was a gift of knowledge. He taught them the art of ring lore. Now, ring lore is not a phrase that Tolkien elaborates upon very much, aside from the obvious, it is lore used to forge the Rings of Power, but he does use it a few times throughout the Lord of the Rings. And I think ring lore is a very important concept to get our heads around. It is the method, or magic, or technology, or whatever word you want to use, that allows a craftsman to create a ring of power, as opposed to just a magical ring. And ring lore comes from Sauron. It is his gift. It is a part of his creation, which means a ring of power cannot be forged without some of Sauron's influence going into it. And it may seem a bit of a strange idea that a craftsman's influence is somehow literally transferred into their works, but this is a significant part of how the most powerful items in Middle-earth are crafted. The greatest craftsmen, the ones who craft the greatest object, do so by investing some part of their own spirit into their work. That is why the high elven blades of Gondolin glow blue in the presence of orcs. The crafters of those swords imbued their weapons with a part of their own cold hatred for orcs, and that is reflected in the properties of their blades. And the Rings of Power are another excellent example of this. They were made using Sauron's ring lore, and so a part of Sauron is invested in all of them, but not all to the same extent. So I've already talked all about the other Rings of Power, and especially the 3 Elven Rings in this video, so check that out to learn more. But what I'll say right now is that the 16 rings, the ones that would go on to be divided among the 9 and the 7, they were forged by Celebrimbor and Sauron together. However, the 3 Elven Rings, they were forged by Celebrimbor alone, and so Sauron was not present to imbue them with his evil. The Elven 3 remain untouched by Sauron, but not entirely free of him. They were made by Celebrimbor, but using Sauron's ring lore. Their power can only exist as long as Sauron exists. Now, after the 16 and the 3 are fully forged, Sauron returns to Mordor, and at the fiery forges of the navaer, right inside the cracks of doom, Sauron forged the One Ring. And this ring is the complete opposite of the Elven 3. This ring was made by Sauron alone. Celebrimbor had no hand in its making. So, unlike the other rings of power, the One Ring is entirely evil. It has the same effects as the other rings of power. It enhances the natural abilities of its bearer, it slows the decay of time, it provides a link to the unseen world, but it cannot be used for good. The One Ring is a tool of dominion, and it was created by Sauron with the intention that it would never be borne by anyone but him, and it would give him the ability to bind all others, to become the master of Middle-earth. But just before I move on, there is one more interesting thing to mention while we're on the topic of ring lore, because the ring lore of Mordor is very briefly mentioned by Tolkien in reference to Saruman. It's a massively blink-and-you-miss-it detail, but in the Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf tells us that Saruman had forged a ring of his own, and he even declares himself Saruman the Wise, Saruman Ring Maker. And this ring of Saruman's is a fascinating little mystery of Middle-earth. Tolkien tells us that Saruman, failing to get possession of the One Ring, would have found in Mordor the missing links in his own research into ring lore. And before long he would have made a great ring of his own with which to challenge the self-styled ruler of Middle-earth. We know that before he came to Isengard, Saruman spent much of the Third Age journeying into the south and the east of Middle-earth, and it would seem that his travels brought him to Mordor, where he discovered many lost secrets of ring lore. Apparently, he even acquired the knowledge necessary to try crafting a great ring of his own. It's very easy to think of Saruman as just being Sauron's puppet during the events of The Lord of the Rings. That is how he's portrayed in the movies, but it's absolutely not how the character was envisioned by Tolkien. Saruman was his own agent who betrayed both Sauron and the Free Peoples pretty early on in the War of the Ring, and he was then forced to pave his own way as an independent third party. He believed that he could claim the One Ring for his own, forge his own ring, supplant Sauron, and then declare himself the new Lord of the Rings, the new ruler of all of Middle-earth. After all, just like Sauron, Saruman was also once a Maiar of crafting, and he too studied under the tutelage of the Vala Aule. He is an incredible craftsman, but we know his plan could never actually have worked. Saruman could never have been truly independent of Sauron, and that is because of the nature of his ring and the nature of the One Ring. Despite all of his skill and all of his knowledge, Saruman's ring was forged using the ring lore of Mordor. And so, even though it was forged thousands of years after the other rings of power, just like them, it was still bound to the One. And when the One Ring was destroyed, Saruman's ring would also have lost whatever power it once possessed. Anyway, back to the One. It remained in Sauron's possession throughout all of the Second Age, and although he was unsuccessful in defeating the elves through military might, with the power of his ruling ring, he pretty much conquered all of Middle-earth anyway. During the long, dark years of the Second Age, almost all the men of Middle-earth came under Sauron's shadow. While he ruled for thousands of years with the One Ring upon his finger, Sauron reached the absolute peak of his power. However, as we all know, right at the end of the Second Age, a last alliance of elves and Númenóreans and also dwarves and birds and beasts came together to do battle with Sauron and eventually to overthrow him. And for the first time in its existence, the One Ring passed to another, Isildur. Now, I have talked very passionately and in great detail about Isildur in previous videos, #Isildur did nothing wrong, but while we're on the topic of the One Ring, this seems like another great opportunity to explain why all the hate Isildur receives for not destroying the ring is completely unfair. Firstly, the whole scene where Isildur and Elrond stand at the cracks of doom and Isildur refuses to cast it into the fire because he's like corrupt or whatever, that is completely invented for the movies. It doesn't happen at all in Tolkien's writings. But what Tolkien did write in letter 131, which is by far his most quotable letter, so great was the ring's power of lust that anyone who used it became mastered by it. It was beyond the strength of any will, even Sauron's own, to injure it, cast it away, or neglect it. Tolkien makes it explicitly clear that absolutely no one could ever willingly destroy the ring. Even Sauron couldn't do it. And so that's why the cracks of doom aren't guarded during The Lord of the Rings. The ring could never let itself be cast into the fire, and so Sauron never even saw its destruction as a potential weakness. It just wasn't a possibility in his mind. Now, you may be thinking, well, then what about Frodo? He does destroy the ring, right? Except no, he doesn't. Frodo achieves the seemingly impossible by bearing the ring all the way to the cracks of doom, but when he gets there, he fails. Like every single other being in Middle-earth, except maybe Tom Bombadil, but even then I highly doubt it, Frodo cannot cast away the One Ring. The only reason that it is eventually destroyed is due to the plan of Ilúvatar, and the treachery of Gollum, and the treachery of the ring itself, and the pity of our Hobbit heroes, Frodo, Sam, and Bilbo. But I think it's hugely important to note that the ring was not thrown into the fire, it was claimed by Frodo, and then by Gollum. And then it fell into the fire against the will of all involved. Which brings us to another very important aspect of how the One Ring works, and that is intent. So I've seen people ask, like, what would happen if, say, a fly flew through the One Ring? Or what if an animal, like, unknowingly ate it? And although I certainly don't think this would be good for said animal, I also think that if there is no intent to claim the ring, then its corruptive powers of dominion will be significantly lessened. And perhaps the greatest example of this is seen in the difference between Sméagol and Bilbo. Sméagol acquired the ring through an act of murder. The very first thing he did was murder Dégol and claim the ring as his own, as his birthday present. Bilbo, on the other hand, he acquired the ring with an act of pity. The very first thing he did whilst wearing the One Ring was spare Gollum's life. And this is a hugely significant detail. The One Ring preys on ambition and malice, and as I said a few moments ago, it enhances the natural abilities of its bearer. Sméagol was greedy, and the ring latched onto that with a vengeance. But Bilbo was kind. He was ruled by compassion. And so the ring failed to corrupt him as it did to Sméagol. If Bilbo had killed Gollum and claimed the ring as his own in the caverns beneath Goblin Town instead of simply bearing it out, then the Hobbit would be a very different story, and I think Bilbo would be a much more Gollum-like creature by the time of The Lord of the Rings. Which brings us back to Isildur, and the whole question of why didn't Elrond just push him into the lava? Now, there are 100 reasons why this is a terrible suggestion, but the most relevant right now is that if Elrond had taken the ring from Isildur, or even if he'd just intended to, the ring would have destroyed him. Even if Elrond had succeeded, we know that he could not have willingly cast it into the fire, literally No one can. Tolkien states that categorically. But if Elrond had taken possession of the One Ring through an act of murder, kinslaying, no less, then all of Middle-earth would have suffered under a new Dark Lord. There is only one way that the ring could have met its end, and that's exactly what ended up happening. If anything were different, everything would have fallen apart. So let's quickly take a look at the exact series of events that took the ring from Sauron's finger all the way into the fires of Mount Doom. We all know that it was cut from Sauron's vanquished hand by Isildur at the end of the War of the Last Alliance, and Isildur kept the ring for the next 2 years. But because #Isildur did nothing wrong, the ring is not so much a corrupting influence on him as it is a painful burden. In his own words, Isildur tells us that it was hot when I first took it, hot as a gleed, and my hand was scorched so that I doubt if ever again I shall be free of the pain of it. And in the unfinished tales we learn that Isildur did in fact have the wisdom and the nobility and the intent, or I guess humble lack of, to perceive that he never could be the master of the One Ring, and that it wasn't a thing that could ever be used for good. During the very battle in which Isildur was killed, his eldest son came to him and said, "What of the power that could cow these foul creatures and command them to obey you?" But Isildur replies, "I cannot use it. I dread the pain of touching it, and I have not yet found the strength to bend it to my will. It should go to the keepers of the three." But literally at that moment, there came a sudden blast of horns, and orcs closed in around Isildur on all sides. But this is another part of the story where the movies massively change Isildur's character, and they make him out to be some kind of a corrupted jerk. In the movies, Isildur flees like a coward, and then the ring betrays him to his death. But in the unfinished tales, we are told that almost the exact opposite of that is true. After 2 of his sons were killed by the orcs, his eldest son came to Isildur and said, "Your last counselor must advise, nay, command you, go. Take your burden and at all costs bring it to the keepers, even at the cost of abandoning your men and me." The son then also died, and reluctantly Isildur set the ring upon his finger with great pain and anguish in his heart. He ran from the orcs and came to the banks of the Anduin River. Then he halted to see if he'd been followed, for he knew that orcs could track a fugitive in the dark by scent, and then in despair he cast off all his armour and plunged into the river. And in the movie, it's all but stated that the ring abandoned Isildur of its own will, and it betrayed him. But in Tolkien's writings, again, the complete opposite actually happens. As Isildur struggles among the clinging reeds, the ring leaves his hand. But this isn't a betrayal on the ring's part, it's actually a good thing. The word Tolkien uses is chance, or chance well used, but as is almost always the case when Tolkien says chance, what I think he means here is the will of Ilúvatar. The ring leaving Isildur and becoming lost in the Anduin River is actually a bit of a victory. It's a greater loss to Sauron than it is to Isildur. We are told that suddenly he knew that the ring had gone. It had left his hand and gone where he could never hope to find it. At first, so overwhelming was his sense of loss that he would have sunk and drowned. But, swift as it had come, the mood passed. The pain had left him. A great burden had been taken away. Isildur then rises up out of the water, and the night-eyed orcs who lurked there were so afraid of him that they loosed their poisoned arrows and shot him through the heart and the throat. Which is, of course, a pretty unpleasant way to go, but Isildur dies free. Right at the end of his life, the ring is taken from him by fate, and his pain is taken away too. This is not a win for Sauron or the Ring. Tolkien writes that if the orcs who killed Isildur had survived long enough to see Sauron's revival, then no tortures would have satisfied his anger with the bungling fools who had let slip the greatest prize in Middle-earth. The Ring wanted to return to its master, and maybe the evil will inside it played some sort of role in inciting the orcs to attack Isildur, although we are told that they had no knowledge of it. But being lost in the Anduin River was not what the Ring had in mind. This is not an act of betrayal on the Ring's part. This is a facet of Ilúvatar's designs. It is the first step on the road to the Ring's destruction. And being lost was a massive inconvenience to Sauron in the short term too. Regardless of who claimed it, it would have eventually found its way back into the Dark Lord's possession, such is the definition of dominion, and if it had become an heirloom of the Dunedain, then I would speculate that Sauron would have reclaimed it relatively early in the Third Age. I mean, the Dunedain's kingdom of Arnor, which is where Isildur was going to rule, that was brought to ruin over 1,000 years before the Lord of the Rings, and that was without the One Ring playing any kind of a role. But thanks to the designs of Ilúvatar, the ring falls into the Anduin, and there it stays for 2,461 years. Which means the Anduin River kept the One Ring for way longer than any of its other bearers. 611 years longer than Sauron kept it, in fact. But, as we all know, 556 years before Frodo set off on his quest to Mordor, the ring was found by the Stoor hobbit Deagol, before he was pretty immediately murdered by his friend Smeagol. The ring dominated Smeagol, and despite his innate hobbit resistance, over the course of 478 years, it turned Smeagol into Gollum. Then, Bilbo acquired the ring, but he began his ownership of it with pity, and I think that is what spared him from the worst of the ring's effects. After 60 years, and with a little help from Gandalf, Bilbo finally gave up the ring, which made him the first person in history to renounce it willingly, and the ring passed to Frodo. Although, very importantly, Frodo did not claim it as his own. He simply kept it sealed away in an envelope until Gandalf came back 17 years later. In the Shire, Gandalf did actually hold the ring for a matter of seconds, but then he immediately gave it back to Frodo, who became its official bearer, although still not its master. He put on the ring a few times at the beginning of his quest, although never to claim it as his own. And so, although the ring did affect Frodo in a very negative way, it wasn't able to dominate him. In the House of Tom Bombadil, the ring very briefly passes to Tom, who seems to be utterly unaffected by it. But I think the reason for this is less to do with any sort of mastery that Tom Bombadil has over the ring, and more to do with the fact that he simply lacked any kind of ambition. So the ring had nothing to latch onto. For the next 168 days, the ring was borne once again by Frodo until the day he was stabbed by Shelob's stinger. On that day, Sam Gamgee became the 9th and final ring bearer, although once again he didn't claim it. He simply took it in the hopes of completing Frodo's quest. However, I do think it's worth noting that although Sam only bore the ring for a single day of his life, it did have a pretty significant effect on him. Tolkien states that when Sam took the One Ring, even before he put it on, he realized that he only had two choices. He could forbear it, basically refrain from taking ownership of it, or he could claim it and use it to challenge the power of Sauron. And in this moment, Sam really does feel the corruptive nature of the ring at work. We are told that already the ring tempted him, gnawing at his will and reason. Wild fantasies arose in his mind, and he saw Samwise the Strong, hero of the age, striding with a flaming sword across the darkened land, and armies flocking to his call as he marched to the overthrow of Barad-dûr. And then, at his command, the Vale of Gorgoroth became a garden of flowers and trees and brought forth fruit. He had only to put on the ring and claim it for his own, and all this could be. But Sam resists. Out of love for his master Frodo and down to plain hobbit sense, he realizes in the core of his heart that he was not large enough to bear such a burden, and the one small garden of a free gardener was all his need and due. Not a garden swollen to a realm, his own hands to use, not the hands of others to command. And this brings us back to intent. Sam could have claimed the ring, and if he had, then all of Middle-earth would have fallen under the dominion of its shortest Dark Lord yet. But Sam acted out of love, and so, just like Bilbo, who acted out of pity, he was able to give it up when he had to. After Frodo's rescue from the Tower of Cirith Ungol, the ring passes back to him, and he bears it for the final 10 days of the quest. But on the final day, on the day that the ring was eventually destroyed, Frodo claimed it, and he used its dominion for the first time. In Tom Bombadil's house, he'd given it up freely, and he'd offered it freely to both Galadriel and Gandalf, but that was because he hadn't yet claimed it as his own. However, on the slopes of Mount Doom, just outside the cracks of Doom, Frodo does finally use the ring as a weapon of dominion. When Gollum attacks, Frodo fights back. He clasps the ring about his neck, and he appears to Sam as a figure robed in white but clutching a wheel of fire to his breast. And it is out of the wheel of fire that Frodo's commanding voice comes. He says to Gollum, "If you touch me ever again, you shall be cast yourself into the fire of doom." Gollum then backs down, and Frodo leaves Sam to deal with him. And the next time we see Frodo, he is standing at the cracks of doom, and he turns and he says to Sam, "The ring is mine." In the final moment, Frodo claims the ring. And because it is literally impossible for anyone to willingly destroy it, hashtag Isildur did nothing wrong, it seems the quest has failed. Frodo puts on the ring, and the power in Barad-dûr was shaken. The towers trembled, and Sauron realized the magnitude of his folly and the thread upon which his doom now hung. But then Gollum comes back, and he bites off Frodo's finger, and just as Frodo declared only one page earlier whilst wielding the One Ring against Gollum, Gollum himself is cast into the fire of doom, and the ring is destroyed. So, what is it exactly that made this happen? Why was the One Ring destroyed despite the fact that no one could willingly destroy it? Well, I think there's 3 threads to this answer. First is the pity of Bilbo and Frodo and Sam. All of them had an opportunity to kill Gollum, and all of them had good reasons to have done so, but none of them did. And because of that, Gollum was still alive and able to bite the ring from Frodo's finger in the final moment, and thus free him of his burden, just as the Anduin River did to Isildur 3,000 years earlier. The second thread of this answer is of course the will of Eru Ilúvatar. He is the one guiding the wheels of the world, and he is the one manipulating chance to such an extent that evil cannot prevail in the end. In letter 192, Tolkien wrote that after Frodo brought the ring to the cracks of doom, his task was done, and the other power then took over, the writer of the story, by which I do not mean myself, that one ever-present person who is never absent and never named. This is clearly Ilúvatar. However, the third thread to the ring's destruction is the one that I find the most interesting, because it is the one that is most intimately bound to the nature of the ring itself. When Frodo and Gollum first meet, and Gollum swears on the precious to serve his new master, Frodo tells him, "It will hold you, but it is more treacherous than you are." And 2 chapters later, Frodo reinforces this by saying, "You swore a promise by what you call the precious. Remember that. It will hold you to it. But it will seek a way to twist it to your own undoing. The desire of it may betray you to a bitter end. The precious mastered you long ago. If I, wearing it, were to command you, you would obey, even if it were to leap from a precipice or cast yourself into the fire." Gollum swears on the One Ring, and he makes an oath not to betray Frodo, and yet in the end he does betray Frodo anyway. However, unlike other oaths in the Legendarium, such as the Binding Oath of Feanor, or the oath made by the men of Dunharrow, who later became the Oath Breakers, the Army of the Dead, this is not an oath sworn on the name of Ilúvatar. This is an oath sworn on the One Ring. It is no less binding, but it is a lot more treacherous. Gollum swore on the ring that he would not hurt Master, and then a good bit later, Frodo uses the dominating power of the ring to declare that Gollum himself would be cast into the fire if he ever touched Frodo again. As it goes, Gollum does break his oath, and he does touch Frodo again when he bites the ring from Frodo's finger, and so the treacherous ring betrays him. It twists him towards his undoing. It causes him to fall backwards into the fire. The ring itself and its wicked will are part of the reason why it is eventually destroyed. In the end, the ring unknowingly betrayed itself. Evil destroyed itself. In the Silmarillion, there is a line right at the beginning in which Eru Ilúvatar states that all things shall, in the end, prove but mine instrument. And I think this is one of the most important sentences that Tolkien ever wrote about his Legendarium. It's probably not quite accurate to say that Ilúvatar intervened to destroy the ring, but more that he designed creation to play out that way. Sauron made it so that no will, including his own, could ever destroy the ring, but Ilúvatar made it so that the evil of the ring would eventually destroy itself. And so, when the ring is destroyed, Sauron's power crumbles, and it is finally removed from Middle-earth. But, contrary to popular belief, he is not, entirely destroyed. As a Maiar, Sauron cannot truly die, not ever. But he is defeated, and he falls so low that none can foresee his arising again. According to Gandalf, he will lose the best part of his strength that was native to him, and he will be maimed forever, becoming a mere spirit of malice that gnaws itself in the shadows, but cannot again grow or take shape. In the end, Sauron suffers the same fate as Saruman. His impotent spirit is blown away on a wind from the west, and he is doomed to remain forever in Middle-earth, almost like a ghost. Without the ring, Sauron has no power, no influence, no ability to deceive or dominate. He is left with nothing but hate and the knowledge of his ultimate ruin. So, there you go. I hope this video maybe answered some questions that you may have had about the One Ring, or at least hopefully it enriched a little bit of your love and appreciation for Tolkien. And I really hope you enjoyed this journey into quite a complex part of Middle-earth's lore. If you did, then hit subscribe to make sure you don't miss any future Middle-earth videos, and hit like and leave a comment with your thoughts if you want to. But, as always, until next time, my dear friends, much love. Stay groovy, and navaer melyn.